That is the critical question. What are the two laws and which one do we need to follow? And there's really only one answer to that. It's interesting, and this has been debated. If you're interested in just interdenominational or the history of doctrine on the law, it's a fascinating subject, because the New Testament says, sometimes it'll say positive things about the law, as if this is for us, do this, and other times it'll say things that are kind of contrary to the law. And the two laws is a way of how do we account for these positive and negative things. And we talk about this in the lesson. One of the ways is, someone said, well, the positive is the Ten Commandments and the negative is the rest, or the positive is it's dealing with sanctification versus justification, and if we're trying to be saved by the law, that's bad. If we're being sanctified by the law, that's good. And those both have merit, but they don't really explain all that we see happening in these texts. Some years ago, I began to think about the whole thing in light of a caterpillar and a butterfly. A caterpillar and a butterfly are really the same creature, but there's been a transformation, there's been a metamorphosis, and we can't help but look at them as two creatures. There's the caterpillar stage that's so limited, earthbound, slow, and then all of a sudden you got the butterfly that's free and flying off, and yet there's a relationship between them. There's a remarkable transformation where one becomes the other. And I think that's a good way to look at the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. Jeremiah tells us that my laws will be written on your heart. So the law is on both sides. We know that. But what form does that law take? And so when we look at these negative and positive comments on the law, I think it's the easiest way to explain that difference is often when we're talking about it from a negative light, the focus is on that weakness of the Old Covenant law. And if you look at it through that lens, you can understand why he's saying something negative in this moment. At the same time, on the positive side, you can see where the positives are being said, because now he's speaking about the law through a New Covenant lens. And there's key verses that really show this, that talk about, just right in the same passage, two kinds of laws. We're going to look at Romans 3, talks about the law of faith and the law of works. Romans 8 talks about the law of the spirit of life versus the law of sin and death. And in Galatians, he could talk about the whole law in two different ways. If you're circumcised and you're going in that way under the Old Covenant, you're under bondage, and you're a debtor to keep the whole law under that form. But just right after that, he says if you're in the spirit with liberty, you're going to fulfill the whole law through the commandment of love your neighbor as yourself. And so we see the whole law in view, but in two different ways. One's Old Covenant approach, one's the New Covenant approach through Christ. This is really a challenging and maybe a little different than what a lot of us are used to thinking, but I hope you'll just look at it and think about it in light of the covenant story and where Paul and the apostles were in this transition, where there was a lot of continuity, but there was also a lot of change going on. And what's so important about this, as we'll see in lessons 11 and 12, is that the way we answer this question of the two laws opens us up to how we look at Scripture as a whole. Once we have ourselves deeply rooted in the law of Christ and looking at all Scripture through the lens of Jesus, then all of a sudden the law opens up to us in an amazing way. And so in the next two lessons, we're going to see how Jesus interacts with the law from a New Covenant standpoint and how Paul interacts with the law through a New Covenant standpoint.